Hi guys, Asmo here, and today I have for you one of the coolest characters I have ever made. It's a Trigger Autobomber Archmage Firestorm Elementalist. Quite a mouthful, but the build itself is basically a walking simulator, and it's actually more than just a build. It's a whole new build archetype that works with many different skills. You can basically swap in any level 1 spell and it will clear T16 maps. I'm going to show you some of the more interesting examples later in this video, but for now let's talk about Firestorm and why are we using that spell and how does the build work. First of all, we're using a weapon trigger to cast the spell. It also makes the spell instant, and Firestorm has a very long cast time. By triggering it, we're bypassing that cast time completely, so that's number one. Secondly, we want a pretty big AoE, because we can only cast every couple seconds, so we don't want to miss monsters too often and have to wait for another cast to kill them. So that's another way in which Firestorm and also Elementalist with the big AoE are a good fit. Third reason is the fact that Firestorm has very low base damage, but it has a built-in 325% more damage multiplier for hits and ailments. So despite the bad added damage efficiency, the real efficiency of added damage is actually great, making it a good spell to scale with the Archmage support. And on top of that, the trigger from the weapon adds 150% more mana cost multiplier to the spell, which has an amazing synergy with the Archmage. So as you can see, there's lots of different synergies between everything we're using, and I'll explain more of them as we go through the gems, then we'll go through the items, and then we'll go through the passives. So let's start with the gems that we're using. We're using the Firestorm, the regular quality, because it gives me increased damage. There is no alt quality that will be actually useful, and the Val Firestorm doesn't really do anything for me because Val Firestorm cannot be triggered, so it basically just doesn't work for this build. We don't care about it. Then we're using Awakened Deadly Ailments, just the highest damage support combination here. We've got Archmage support. The Archmage is just regular Archmage. We got Awakened Swift Affliction, Awakened Burning Damage, and then we've got Anomalous Combustion. The Anomalous quality here makes the Ignites deal damage faster. This is basically the most damage you can get from the links. Then we are using Arcanist Brand, which has increased duration, Anomalous Flammability, and Anomalous Flame Surge. So that's basically for single target. If I'm fighting a boss, I'm gonna put the Arcanist Brand, and it's gonna debuff the enemy with the damage of on the ground, right? The burning ground, and also the flammability curse. And then we have Anomalous Arcane Surge linked with Arcane Cloak, increased duration, and enhanced support. So you can use Arcane Cloak with the increased duration, or you can use it with the increased buff effect. Whatever you prefer. I'm using it with duration because I'm losing some duration later on from different places where I'm going to show you. But to compensate for that, to make this last longer, basically that's what we're using. And you can see Arcane Surge lasts for a very long time and gives me mana regen. It's a very nice added damage and survivability that we're getting. And then we're using level 21 Clarity just for additional mana regeneration. And we're using a Phase Run with increased duration and enhanced support for more speed. So Phase Run by default has 4-second cooldown. It is the same cooldown as the trigger on the weapon. So as you're adding cooldown reduction to your character, you can see now we got 1.99 seconds, and here we got 1.99 seconds. So we got 1.99 seconds cooldown on all of our, by default, like 4-second cooldown spells. So that way we're casting every 2 seconds instead of every 4 seconds. So we're basically cutting that in half, and I'm going to show you later which pieces of gear do that for me. And that's it basically when it comes to the gems. Here I have like examples of these level 1 gems, which I'm going to talk about later. But now let's go over the gear. So the main piece of this build is of course the weapon, because it has to have the trigger. I spent way too much currency on this weapon compared to the rest of the build. Rest of the build is fairly achievable, but this is very expensive. This was very expensive to craft. Part of the reason was of course the tree. On the tree we got -1 to power charges, 6% cooldown recovery per power charge, and with some others, like you can get a bunch of different sources of power charges. You can end up with way more than I have. I have right now 3 power charges only, but this is enough cooldown reduction for me at the moment, but you can get more than that, right? So I have 4 because of the Forbidden Jewels, right? So we're using Forbidden Power, which is the occultist node for power charge and power charge generation when you spend mana, but that's how we're getting some extra cooldown recovery. Then we've got this node, reduced skill effect duration and increased cooldown recovery. 10% reduced skill effect duration is very easy to bypass because we're casting things so often. The Arcane Cloak and the Phase Run, the duration doesn't really matter, and that's also like I'm using so much increased duration and enhances in here because I got a lot of sockets, because I'm not using auras. Then we can completely just disregard that that little drawback. So 25% cooldown recovery here. Then we've got the node that pretty much carries the entire build super hard. Reduced reservation efficiency of skills is a negative, but since we're not reserving anything, we don't really care about it, other than just the clarity, which is a very small amount. But the 2.5% mana regenerated per second is massive. It's a huge, basically like doubles my mana regen. It's a crazy amount of mana regeneration. It gets scaled by all of the increases to mana regeneration. So this is the node that was like the most important to get, and that carries it really hard. Without this, this build would definitely require more investment to get the same amount of mana regeneration to keep up with the huge amount of mana that we're spending. And then we've got increased global damage, increased cost of skills, both upsides. So that's really good. That was the last node I put on this tree, and that's basically all you need for this build. And then the weapon itself, by far the most damage out of all of the modifiers is given to you by fire damage over time multiplier, not even the +3, nothing else. Like flat damage doesn't really do that much. So what I did is I fractured the T1 fire damage over time multiplier, because then I knew I can then sort out the prefixes, do the prefixes, and then lock prefixes and go for unveil for the trigger to guarantee the trigger, and then last mod just craft something on the suffix, right? So I fractured the fire damage over time multiplier. Fractures are very expensive now. I also got quite unlucky on this. I spent a lot of divines just trying to fracture this, but eventually we got it. And then I just spam basically scorched fossils, because there are so many different modifiers you can get. You can get on suffix, you can also get like burning damage, increased fire damage. The best thing to get is +3 to level of all fire skill gems, and then increased fire damage. The flat damage is also nice, and since I got a combination of modifiers that would basically take 1,000 rerolls, like 1,000 tries in order to have a chance for something better, I decided to stick with this and then craft the trigger. Crafted the trigger. The trigger is basically like 1 in 4, 1 in 5 chance to get it from Ashling, but it cannot brick the you cannot really brick the stuff at that point. It's like guaranteed. You basically do prefixes cannot be changed, and then you make sure that this is the only suffix that you have that isn't the fractured mod. Go to Ashling, she's gonna replace the meta mod for unveil. Then you block power charge, damage per power charge, and then you unveil and you get like 1 in 5, 1 in 4, maybe like 3 in 10 or something like that, in order to get this this trigger. And that is basically what the build is based around, right? So we have to have it. We cannot craft it because the crafted version is 8-second cooldown, so that would be very terrible to play with. And so that's why we're doing this. And then mana regeneration, right? Because we really need that. So that's the weapon, the most important, by far the most expensive piece. That gives me tons of cooldown reduction, tons of recovery, basically enables the whole build. There's also an option to go with a bow, because that's also something you can do to have a 6-link, and you can also go with like a one-hander plus a squire, but we don't really benefit as much from squire and one-hander. Like it's really better to have it this way because of the huge amount of like fire damage over time multiplier and +3 to all the fire skill gems. So this was the better option to go for. Plus we need some defense because the character really lacks defense, so having some extra block from the staff really helps. Squire would also provide me with some block, but I think like the 200 version was a little bit better for what I was going for. So then next we have the helmet. For helmet, I went for the AoE enchant, and then basically I crafted with with essences for mana. So I was spamming the mana essence because there are so many different modifiers that we can get. We can get nearby enemies have minus to fire res. We can get +1 power charge, which would be great as well. We can get increased elemental damage. So I just needed one of those modifiers, huge mana, get some life on it, and good resistances. That's all I needed. So I was spamming this with essences until I got something decent. Then next item, the two big items that are very important that enable this build are the cooldown recovery items. So first we got the boots, and then we got the belt. So for boots, there is an option to do Awakener Orb craft with 20% cooldown recovery rate, like a T1 cooldown elevated. This is actually elevated cooldown recovery. Combine it with Hunter modifier for ignites deal damage faster, and then get some good suffix on that, and then you can finish it the way you normally finish boots, with like Veiled Chaos Orb or Ashling for movement speed, and then crafted life. But I decided to just go for the ailment immunity through shock, so I crafted with the shock essence until I get T1 cooldown recovery rate. And then basically what I did is I locked the suffixes, and I did basically augment an influence modifier. So influence there's a modifier where you can like augment an influence modifier, reforge an influence item with a random modifiers, including influence modifier. So if you lock your suffixes, you can actually just force that mod on it, and then you use the Maven's Orb of Conflict, right, to elevate the cooldown recovery rate. You can just basically guarantee the 50-50 over, just spam essence until you get the cooldown recovery and some suffix you like, lock the suffixes, force the influence mod, and then elevate it, and it's 50-50, right? So that's how I crafted the boots, and then divine them to just get 20% cooldown recovery rate, because that's the most important modifier. The other chance to avoid shock we got, I think, in one of these jewels. Yep, that's a chance to avoid being shocked. And then we've got, of course, the Storm Shroud, and that gives me complete ailment immunity. And then Stygian Vice. Stygian Vice you can craft with basically any essence you want. You can craft them with, for example, Chaos Essence. I think I found this one actually on trade. That was pretty undervalued because I also want mana on this. So you can either spam Mana Essence, Chaos Res Essence, whatever you need. But it's pretty difficult to get all of the mods because I want life, I want mana, I want 2 good resistances, and I want the cooldown recovery rate. So it's difficult to get all of those things. So basically you can try to spam an essence for one of the resistances, hit the cooldown recovery rate with some other suffix that is decent, and then do the prefixes after. But it's really nice to get the extra mana, so that's probably something that you should try to snipe. And even if it's like a lower level, you can do the trick with the forcing influence modifier and then elevating it as well. And you might, if you can buy the bases quite cheap with the tier 2 cooldown recovery, then you could do that as well. And Stygian Vice is best because we can use the jewels, and the jewels are super important because they give us extra mana and extra cooldown recovery rate. It's one of the only sources of cooldown recovery rate you can get in the entire game. It's very, very hard to come by this stat. It's like there's no like other modifiers that you can get it from, really. Then we've got gloves, super simple, just get a bunch of mana life resistances, some missing strength and dex, and I got exposure and fire damage over time multiplier. Super simple pair of gloves. We're using Polaric Devastation for covering enemies with Ash. We're using Atsiris Foible just for mana regen, and allocating the Crusader, which is the node over here that gives me maximum mana and also increases and reductions to mana also apply to damage, right? And it's not just spell damage. That's why we're using this instead of using the helmet, for example, because the helmet gives me a lot of increased mana, but it doesn't actually give me as much benefit as you would think. The helmet that like increases your defense, right, like life, mana, and energy shield. So we're using this +2 damage over time multiplier with some mana, and int amulet would of course be better than this, but it would be very, very expensive. It would be like 20 divines or something like that to get that. So that's why we went with a much cheaper option, because it's almost as good. And then we've got the ring, Cerulean Ring, which gives you the increased maximum mana. This I crafted on a fractured base that had T1 res, and I basically crafted with the increased mana regeneration rate essence until I got some decent suffix. And then I also hit the mana. So mana is a pretty common modifier, so it's quite easy to hit mana. So I was just spamming the essence for the mana regen until I got some decent suffix and good mana, and that's it. And I just crafted life at the end on top of this. And then the chest. Someone on the stream was asking like, wouldn't another chest be better for this build? And the answer is no. No chest would be better for this build unless you can find a chest with cooldown reduction, because this chest gives me up to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so 18% cooldown reduction, right? With this, it's 21% cooldown reduction from the Abyss Jewels, because we can get Abyss Jewels that have mana, fire damage to spells, physical damage to spells also applies to my base damage for Ignite because I'm playing Elementalist, and then also cooldown recovery rate, which goes up to 3%. So that's the type of jewel we're looking for. You can get Corrupted Blood on it, you can get phasing on it, although phasing it is not necessary because we are using phase run, so that's actually, but if you're gonna use, like, for example, Arcane Cloak on left click, and you're gonna have more movement speed, for example, then you could do something like that, right? But then you're not gonna be able to trigger with this unless you like take the whole damage immediately, right? So phase run on the left click I think is like the best option for this. That's why we don't really need the phase run. You can also get the jewels that are corrupted like this with more than just the cooldown recovery. So this one has cooldown recovery, it has mana, it also has life and strength and dex. Both are attributes that I really need, and the Atsiris Foible also helps me fit these attribute requirements, right? Because it lowers gem and item attribute requirements, which is very, very nice. And we got things like life, mana, res, extra res, cooldown recovery. So the corrupted jewels are really, really good. I would recommend, if you want to play this build, a while before you want to do that, start sniping jewels on trade, because this is not something that you can find very commonly. A cooldown recovery rate is a pretty rare mod. It's hard to find the cooldown plus mana plus something else, especially at this point of the league. So if you want to play something like this, I definitely recommend sniping these earlier on in the league. And for flasks, Cinder, Solo, Urn, plus just regular defensive flasks plus movement speed. And then let's talk about the passives. So for passives, maybe I'll move on to POB. And let's look here. We got 12 million DPS. This is a config for a pinnacle boss, right? So we got just regular pinnacle boss. The trigger from the weapon is not counted because, as you can see here, mana cost 3.64. If I remove this, mana cost 1,400, which is incorrect. My mana cost is 3,685. So POB doesn't calculate this from the trigger, even though we have the Firestorm socketed in weapon, right? So that doesn't count. That's why I have that typed in manually in here. So we've got 12 million DPS. We got actually a big amount of regen because we got 1,300 life recovery per second. We've got MOM. We've got the arcane cloak. So we got a good recovery and like a decent health pool. But what the build lacks really is like some extra mitigation and avoidance, right? It really lacks like a grace. You could have like a grace that you're casting from like a divine blessing, right? You could have like a divine blessing grace or something like that you're keeping up, but I really don't want to press another button, so I can't be bothered with that. But that would help the build a lot in terms of survivability. So let's look first at the ascendancy points. So pretty self-explanatory, I think, because we're using Shaper of Flames. Any ignite build is going to use that. That way we are turning our lightning damage into something that can be used for the ignite. But if we were not playing Elementalist, you can just use whatever Stormfire or whatever it's called, this Opal unique ring that allows your lightning damage to ignite, and then the build can be played on any other ascendancy. So then we have also Mastermind of Discord plus Heart of Destruction. That was one of the main reasons that I went for Elementals, because I can use Heart of Destruction and also get the Forbidden Power, Forbidden Jewels for extra AoE, right? So these two things gives me a lot of AoE, which really helps with the clear. AoE is pretty important for this archetype. And Shaper of Storm just gives me like 20% shock. It's just a nice amount of damage, right? So these nodes, this is 18.8% more damage. And the Forbidden Power gives me power charge generation +1 to maximum power charge, which helps me with the cooldown recovery as well. So pretty straightforward. We are pathing through here. Here we're grabbing Transcendent Mind. So Transcendent Mind gives me damage over time multiplier and also gives me mana recovery per intelligence allocated in the passives in the radius, right? So this spot has pretty good amount of intelligence. This spot also has good amount of intelligence, but we would have to allocate some extra nodes. That would be an option if I was, for example, heading toward like Arcane Will for extra mana. That's a viable option as well, but I decided instead I'm gonna go for like the Arcane Capacitor here, since we gotta go for the Agnostic anyway. So that's what we're using, Transcendent Mind here for the extra damage over time multiplier plus mana recovery. We've got Mind over Matter, anything that has like mana regen that is decent to take, we're taking. Increased mana cost, we got some increased effect of non-damaging ailments that helps our shock effect. And then we've got a Healthy Mind here, which allows us to grab not only the node itself, these nodes are also useful because it's 8% increased mana, 8% increased mana, 20% increased mana. So that's just like grabbing something like this, right? Deep Thoughts is pretty much the same thing as grabbing something like that. But on top of that, it also allows us to path through here to this Battle Ruse node, and while we're pathing through it, we're getting this life instead applying to mana, right? So we're getting increased mana. Here we get a Battle Ruse which gives 10% damage taken recouped as mana, and here 10% damage taken recouped as mana. This is really useful on an MOM build, because if you're taking a damage and it's draining your mana, it's going to be hard for you to cast spells. So you want something to recover your mana while you're taking damage as well, right? So this is really, really useful for that. And we're also using Watcher's Eye for that. 20% of damage taken while affected by clarity recouped as mana, and also increased mana recovery rate while affected by clarity. You can also use the other jewel, For clarity, right, you can use the Uber jewels for clarity as well. That's another option you can look into. What else do we have? We are pathing this way for the fire damage with AoE, fire damage over time multiplier, grabbing life, grabbing arcane capacitor, and agnostic. So agnostic gives me huge amount of regen. If you look at my life regen, goes from 60 to 1360, right? It does cut my mana regeneration, right? So without that, my mana regeneration would be much higher, but the mana regeneration only has to be half of the mana cost, right? So we have 4000 mana regeneration per 2 seconds, and we are spending 1.6 per 2 seconds, right? So the mana regeneration is, that's how you want to look at that. What else do we have? We have cluster jewels. So all the cluster jewels are burning bright, smoking remains, widespread destruction. The reason is I want the AoE and I want the AoE here. So we got double AoE, and then if I had extra points, smoking remains is a very good node as well. And for the mediums, you want wasting affliction, because this gives you increased damage with ailments, and ailments deal damage faster. So this is like a 5.5% damage at this point, right? 5.8 if you don't have it allocated. So this is a really good amount of damage per point. Here we have Cooked Alive as well, Forbidden Flames, and we got Student of Decay because my Chaos Res sucks. So I wanted to get at least some Chaos Res, so I got a couple of Student of Decay. And we got Fan the Flames for the Ignite Proliferation for a much nicer clear. These nodes are pretty important. Ignites inflict, you inflict, deal damage faster. Very big multiplier to your damage. As you can see, with this, it's like what, 3.4% per point, right? This is 4.5. This is a huge amount of damage. Like this node itself, 10% damage. So that's a huge amount of damage. And here we also have Unnatural Instinct. So this Unnatural Instinct, it's pretty decent. It gives me a decent amount of mana regen. It gives me 7% damage. So this is a pretty decent Unnatural Instinct to get, because we're getting all of these like mana nodes that we're not using. We're getting some extra block. That is also very helpful, right? Block and spell block. So that's just some extra stuff that helps. Power charge duration also helps. Effect of curses also helps, right? So that's just like very efficient. There's nothing like super strong, but it's just a lot of very useful little things for this Unnatural Instinct to fit in here. And that's basically it when it comes to the passives. The character is fairly complicated, but it can be improved by a lot. There is so much stuff that you can do with the gear. Gloves can be so much better. The helmet can have the power charge. The boots can have the ignite modifier, like ignites deal damage faster and can be just do so much damage. And of course, like I said before, the build works with many different skills. So I have tested multiple different skills. Some of the notable ones you're gonna see now on screen. So for example, Bladefall. The nice thing about Bladefall, it has 140% effectiveness of added damage. It has pretty good AoE. It works similarly to the Firestorm. So Bladefall actually feels pretty nice to play. Feels like pretty similar playstyle to what Firestorm feels like. And what you're seeing in this footage is level 1 0 quality Bladefall. Basically just straight from the vendor. Level 1 gem, right? This is what is doing all that damage, right? And it's a T16 map. And then we have a Blade Vortex. Blade Vortex is really cool, and if you were to make slightly different build, if you for example played it on a Saboteur, got more cooldown reduction, stack duration, you can also steal the Trickster node for action speed and go self-curse temp chains, right? To make the blades last longer, you can actually make a Blade Vortex that will fully stack to 10, and then you will just stay at 10 stacks without having to press any buttons, right? Like the ultimate comfort of a Blade Vortex. So that's something that can be actually made with this tech. Then we've got Exsanguinate. Exsanguinate felt pretty good in terms of the clear. The chains are really nice, but it wasn't really anything special. But it was one of the skills that felt better, but it's quite inconsistent. Then we've got Armageddon Brand. Armageddon Brand, of course, a great fit for this because it leaves something that lingers and deals damage and clears a little bit better. And you know, the types of damage and everything fits very well. So Armageddon Brand felt pretty good. The only drawback of that, like, it's worse than Firestorm here because it has a little bit of a delay, right? So it has to like attach to something and hit something rather than just fall from the sky immediately. So that's why Armageddon Brand has a little bit of a delay, feels definitely worse than Firestorm. Then we've got Crackling Lance, which actually surprisingly feels really good. For some reason, it has just huge AoE, and whenever it zaps like the entire pack, everything gets ignited and dies. It has pretty good effectiveness of added damage. It's 165 effectiveness of added damage, so it works pretty well, even though we're not benefiting from the intensity, right? We're not like just cast speed spamming it. It still works pretty well. Like it looks surprisingly good. And then of course Arc, that's another very similar skill to Crackling Lance, in the sense that it's just gonna hit the entire pack, it's gonna chain through the pack, ignite everything, and the ignite proliferation is gonna spread through a pretty big area. So especially if you could get like some extra chains or make it fit in some other way in your build, Arc is another good candidate for that. So that's basically it. These are the skills that have like some notable skills that can be played. And the future of this, I think, is going to be that this is probably going to be played on a saboteur, because we're gonna lose the Crucible tree, so we're gonna lose a lot of different things here, right? We're gonna lose the cooldown recovery rate, we're gonna lose some of the regeneration, but there is a lot of options that can be explored with the Saboteur, because Saboteur has the extra 30% cooldown recovery rate, and also it has a lot of AoE, right? So you can see area of effect, tons of AoE and AoE damage. So Saboteur is something that I might be exploring in the future. Could also be played on a Scion. Scion gets like basically half of that. Scion gets the AoE and half of the cooldown recovery rate, but those are like the only sources of the cooldown recovery rate. It's very hard to get. If the next league mechanic or the next league brings us some more cooldown recovery rate, then it's gonna be better. But yeah, there's some also options with trigger bots, right? Because you can do that, and trigger bots will trigger your spell. I have tested it with a lot of different skills. For example, for BV, it gives you 2 blades instead of 1, but the blades are around you. Another cool skill this actually works with is Voltaxic Burst. So the way Voltaxic Burst works is that you cast it earlier, and then as you run into the monster, it's basically just going to be exploding. So every couple seconds you're going to be exploding. You don't have to cast while you're on top of the monster. So Voltaxic Burst is something that can also work with this, and it's probably the best way, one of the best ways to make this build work, because you're going to be basically exploding every couple seconds. Anyway, the duration of the skill doesn't really matter, so you can just stack duration if you want, and therefore get more damage multiplier from that. But that's it. This is a very interesting build. I definitely don't recommend it for beginners, because it's going to be very difficult to assemble, but I think it's a cool archetype, and it'll be nice to see if other people are going to explore it and find some other uses for this and how to make it work with just basically any skill, right? You can fit any skill in this and play it in so many different ways. So that's it. Thank you so much guys for watching. POB will be in the description. See you next time.